Okay, let's dive in. Let's start with a question this morning. Let me ask you a question to start off with. What's the answer? Absolutely not, right? I'm sure you all read the New York Times this morning and saw this was the article on the front page of the New York Times this morning. Yours truly is mentioned somewhere in here, so way to go, UVM. We made it into the New York Times this morning. Feel free to treat this morning's article as optional reading. You all probably could have written this at some point. GPT is amazing, but it seems to be missing something. What is that something that could be missing? Here's one candidate, right? Okay, so, all right, back to trying to answer this question of what is the relationship between intelligence and the body? If we want to embody intelligence in a robot and have it run around, how do we get the robot to do what we want, to do it safely? We're going to evolve it in simulation, cross our fingers, try and cross the reality gap. So this morning, we started in last time on the fifth and final and arguably the most recent attempt to cross the sim to real gap that was published a few years ago. And the sort of common title for this project is Robots That Can Adapt Like Animals. Why is this particular approach to the sim to real gap referred to as trying to get robots to adapt like animals? Because animals and organisms, under certain conditions, if something goes wrong to the body or something changes in the environment, we have to try and adapt as quickly as possible. Yeah. All the four attempts to cross the sim to real gap that we've seen so far, those were experiments that sort of unfolded over hours or days or weeks. No one was in any hurry to get the robot to do whatever it is we wanted it to do. In this project, it's going to be all about speed. I showed you these slides last time. In this case, they're working with a hexapedal robot. Taking a page from our book, they're going to damage the robot in various ways and count in wall clock time. How many seconds does it take for the robot to recover the ability to carry on with its mission, which, as usual, is forward locomotion? Yeah. So here's the little cartoon of one of their more successful attempts within 4 trials. Which elapse over about 20 seconds, and we'll see the video in a moment. This injured robot was able to recover forward locomotion, which it was capable of before damage. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's watch a video summary of this project, and I'm going to just mute it and talk over it as it goes. There's a particular evolutionary algorithm at work here called the map elites algorithm, and we'll talk about map elites in a few slides. They're going to use map elites, this evolutionary algorithm, to do what you all have done now many times, which is to train gaits for a simulated robot. As they evolve the robot to walk forward, they're going to measure behavioral features of the robot, which we saw last time in the transferability project, right? For any given controller, it causes the robot to move, and we can then observe the phenotype, the way in which the robot moves. In this little cartoon here, for this particular evolved gait, in the video they're pointing out a particular behavioral feature, which is the amount of time that any one leg spends on the ground. In this video, the middle left leg here spends less than 10% of the time touching the ground. As you'll see as this video continues to play, they didn't evolve just a single gait. They evolved not just hundreds of gaits. They evolved tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of different gaits for this robot, all of which are evolved to cause the robot to move forward as quickly as possible. So here's yet another gait where the front 2 legs spend very little time on the ground. So they got a whole bunch of different evolved controllers, all produce different gaits, different but successful gaits on the simulated robot. Okay, I'll put this on double time just so you get a sense of the kind of diversity that they're able to evolve using their map elites evolutionary algorithm. They're going to rely on this diversity of gates when they move from sim to real. Perverse instantiation at work again, yeah? 13,000 different gates, okay. Okay, now in this second video, we're gonna watch them going, starting in sim as we just saw, and they're gonna go to real. Okay. They actually worked with two different robots, one that walks on the left and one that drops balls into a tin on the right. So before deployment, before they go to real, they're going to evolve all these different gates, and they're going to create a map of all these different gates. And here's a visualization of this map. So in this particular, at this point in time here, they have these 9 different evolved gates. They're going to take all of these different evolved gates, and they're going to plug them into a map, basically a high-dimensional matrix or a tensor. They're going to take each of these evolved gates and put it in a particular place in this tensor. And we're going to talk about how exactly they do that in a moment. Okay, so there's 9 gates, and you'll see this heat map behind. Every pixel in this heat map corresponds to one unique evolved gate. Okay. Here's the robot before damaged. They've taken all of these different simulated gates, and they've gone through and found one that transfers to reality. We haven't talked about how they choose which one from this map to send to reality. We'll come back to that in a moment. Assume that they figured out how to do that. They have this particular gate, which allows the physical robot to move forward by 25 centimeters per second. So they're going to treat this as sort of the bar that they want to return to after the robot is damaged. Who knows how fast this robot actually can walk? This is as good as they were able to get it to do before damage. Come in and introduce some change. Like in the resilient machines project that we talked about last week, this physical robot cannot sense the damage directly. Yeah? All it knows is that now it's traveling much slower. Now it's only traveling 3 centimeters per second. Here's the first attempt in reality. The robot is going to perform a handful of experiments. It's going to try and carefully pull from all of these 13,000 gates that it evolved previously. It's going to try and find which one among those 13,000 is most likely not just to cross the sim to real gap, but to help with the damaged robot. Allow the damaged robot to recover its gate. Yeah? So the sim to real gap here is actually more difficult because we're going to try not just to cross the gap, but also to find a controller that works for basically a new or different real robot, the damaged real robot. Okay. They're going to use Bayesian optimization to find this gate in simulation, and we'll come back to that in a moment. We're sort of seeing the high-level view of this experiment. Here's the first attempt after damage. You can see they didn't do too badly. The robot's already back up to 13 centimeters per second. Here's the second attempt. Worse, 10 centimeters per second. Third attempt, 17 centimeters per second. And I'm just going to pause here for a moment. In the upper right here, this is wall clock time. So this is 18 seconds after the robot has been damaged. Questions so far? I'm holding off on the technical details for now, just trying to give you an overview for how this works. Okay, this is the third attempt, 18 seconds in. Fourth attempt, 21, 22 seconds in, back to 20 centimeters per second. fifth attempt, and basically the robot has recovered from its injury. There's a sixth attempt, and it's kind of fallen back off again, but it's definitely moving forward again. Okay. So among those 6 trials, here was the best one it was able to discover. You'll remember our discussion when we talked about legged locomotion, about stance phase, flight phase. I don't think there's quite a flight phase here, but definitely most of the mass of the robot is leaving the ground. Not really important for this particular experiment, but just interesting to see what kinds of compensating gaits this algorithm comes up with. And the last part of this summary video, which we'll get to at the end of the lecture today, this is a demonstration of generality. This algorithm they came up with that allows robots to recover from injury works not just for legged robots that locomote, but also for robot arms that have to do pick and place tasks. Pick an object and place it, in this case, into the tin. This robot arm has been damaged. It's not able to drop balls into the tin. It runs the same algorithm you just saw for the legged robot. We've got wall clock time again running in the upper right. So the robot is trying to compensate from this injury, which is a kink in its shoulder. It's trying a few attempts, 16 seconds, 17 seconds, and after 20 seconds, within 20 seconds, it's found a way to compensate for this injury. Okay, we'll get into the results in a moment. Okay, so how does this algorithm manage to find among these large number of evolved controllers that it's already evolved in simulation? How does it find the needle in the haystack? How does it find the one that transfers well to reality and recovers from the injury? Okay, here we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, they're going to do thousands and thousands of runs of this map elite algorithm. Remember, we're going to start with our simulated undamaged robot here. So the hexapod knows it's a hexapod. This is different from the Resilient Machines project. It knows it's got 6 legs. And over here, this is a visualization of the high-dimensional search space, otherwise known as the fitness landscape. Yeah? You remember that in a fitness landscape, for all of the genes in the genome that we have that many number of horizontal dimensions in the fitness landscape. If we have a neural controller for our robot that has 128 synaptic weights, then the fitness landscape has 128 horizontal dimensions. We have a high dimensional space, and the 129th vertical dimension is the fitness of that particular controller. Yeah, so far so good. The authors here can't draw in 128 or 109 dimensions, so they're showing you a tesseract here, which is a 4-dimensional cube. Just to remind you that for every controller we run on the hexapod here, it has a unique place in this high-dimensional space. So far so good? Okay. They are now going to define 2 other spaces. So in the map elites algorithm, which is what we're now describing, and we'll see why it's called the map elites algorithm in a moment. There are 3 spaces. There's the one that should be more familiar to you, the fitness landscape over here. And then there are 2 additional spaces. This blue one here is the confidence space. And the lower one here is the behavioral space. Yeah? Okay, what are these lower dimensional spaces? Let's start with the behavioral space down here. Remember that every time they run a controller on the robot, the synaptic weights of that controller are the genotype, and the way the robot moves is the phenotype. And like we saw last time, we can generate a vector that summarizes the phenotype or the way that the robot moves. That's what they're going to do in this experiment. In this experiment with the hexapod, they're going to measure as the hexapod is moved by any given controller, They're going to measure the fraction of time that each of the 6 legs spends on the ground. Yeah? So if this robot were to shuffle along the ground so that none of the 6 legs ever leave the ground, you can imagine a length 6 vector, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. 100% of the time, all the legs stay on the ground. Yeah? If there was a hypothetical other controller that allowed the robot to stay off the ground for the entire length of the simulation, that would be a length 6 vector of 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? 50% of the time, another controller causes all 6 legs to spend 50% of the time on the ground, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, and so on. Yeah? So for any possible controller, you can imagine after that controller has been simulated, the simulator spits out a length 6 vector. We can treat the 6 numbers in that vector as coordinates in a 6-dimensional space. Obviously, they can't draw in 6 dimensions, so they're visualizing this in 2 dimensions. Imagine we only watched the front 2 legs of the hexapod. If a controller caused the front 2 legs to spend all the time on the ground, that would take us to 1, 1 in this space, this very right-hand pixel over here. So far, so good? So we're using the description of the behavior as a coordinate in the behavior space. Yeah? So you can now think of this little cartoon here. Every colorized pixel corresponds to 1 evolved controller. You know how we get to the position of any given pixel in this space. What do you think the color of the pixel represents?
The fitness.
The fitness, yeah? So red is going to be bad. These are controllers that cause the robot to stay still or walk backwards, which is not what we want. Fitness here is forward travel. The greener the pixel, green means go, that's good, that's what we want. So pixels out here, or sorry, controllers located around here cause the simulated robot to move forward as quickly as possible. So far, so good? So we have a very high dimensional space over here, which is the parameter space. If you think of the parameters as the synaptic weights of the controller, very, very high dimensional. A much lower space over here that corresponds to the behavior space. This confidence space has the same dimensionality as the behavioral space. So for every pixel in the behavioral space, it has a corresponding pixel in confidence space. And you'll notice at the beginning of this experiment here, all of the confidence pixels are blue, cool colors. What do you think the pixel in the confidence space represents? Remember, it has a corresponding pixel in behavioral space.
How likely it is to be able to cross this into reality yet?
Absolutely. So the pixels over here are going to represent the confidence of the algorithm about how well things will transfer from sim to real. And at this point in 2015, the community has learned the sim to real gap is broad, it's wide. Before you start sending anything across the gap, best thing is to have low confidence that anything will cross the gap. Yeah, pretty good place to start. So far, so good? Okay. Now you'll remember I mentioned here that they're going to perform many, many trials. They're going to evolve thousands and thousands and thousands upon thousands of evolved controllers. And for all those controllers, they're going to try and find a place for those controllers in the behavioral space. So you can think of the pixel in behavioral space as obviously having a color, which is the fitness, but it also contains a pointer that points to that actual evolved controller, that actual set of 128 synaptic weights. Yeah? Let's run the map elites algorithm now using this cartoon as a guide. Like all evolutionary algorithms, we're going to start by generating some random controllers. Let's start simple and just create one random controller, run it on our simulated robot, and at this point the behavioral space is all white. All of the pixels are not occupied. Yeah? Okay. We've run our random controller on the simulated robot. We've got back the fraction of time that the 6 legs have spent on the ground, which tells us where we need to go in behavioral space. We know the fitness of that controller from simulation, so we drop that controller into that empty cell in behavioral space and colorize that pixel based on fitness. Yeah? Okay, good. We've placed one controller in this space. We could generate another random controller and try and find a place for it in behavioral space. Since 2015, there are now hundreds of versions of this algorithm. We're going to start with the original one here, which is the simplest one. We're going to take that random evolved controller we just created and allow it to produce an offspring. We're going to make a copy of it, and we're going to introduce some random mutation to the set of weights. Take that second controller, run it on the simulated robot. Presumably, it's going to cause the simulated robot to move differently, which is going to take us to a different place in behavioral space. Drop that controller in that empty cell, colorize that pixel based on the fitness. So far, so good. We now have 2 controllers embedded in behavioral space. Flip a coin. Heads, we choose the first controller. Tails, we choose the second controller. Allow it to produce an offspring. Find a place in behavioral space for this third controller, embed it, and repeat and repeat and repeat. And as we do this thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of times, the behavioral map is going to start to fill up with controllers and colorized pixels. So far, so good?
How reliant is it upon like the behavioral space being like a continuous surface? If that makes sense.
Good question. Yeah, so as you can see, it's a continuous surface here. Not surprisingly, if we take 2 pixels that are next to one another in behavioral space, what can we say about the phenotypes of the simulated robot when it's run with those 2 controllers? They're likely similar, right? So yes, you're right. There's quite a bit of continuity in behavioral space, which yes, they're going to exploit in a moment when we try and cross the sim to real gap. And you'll see that. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's keep running this map elites algorithm in our head. We keep going, the space starts to fill up. Something new is going to start to happen shortly. There's a bit of an issue, or there's an additional twist that we're going to have to build into this algorithm. What's going to happen as controllers start to fill up this behavioral space? There are fewer and fewer empty slots. There's going to be a collision, right? So at some point, we're going to run a controller on this simulated robot. We're going to go to its position in behavioral space, and there's going to be a controller already sitting in that cell. How do you think the map elites algorithm resolves that collision?
Does it compare the fitness and puts a better one in?
Bingo, right? Only one controller can exist in any one cell in behavioral space. So if there's a collision, look at the 2 fitness values. Whoever has the highest fitness value pushes the other one out and takes over that cell. That's why it's called the elite algorithm. We're only keeping the elites. Unlike all the other evolutionary algorithms we've seen so far, which is populations of controllers, at any point in evolutionary time, at any point during the running of your evolutionary algorithm, you can look across the population and you'll have high fitness and low fitness individuals, right? And these are the ones that are always in danger of being killed off. In the map elites algorithm, if we look in any one cell, there's only one there, the elite. And it's probably killed off or pushed out many, many others in that spot as we keep this algorithm running. So far, so good? Okay, and it's called the map elites algorithm because we're dealing with maps here. We're using behavioral descriptions, fraction of time the 6 feet spent on the ground, as a position into this map. We're mapping behavior into positions in this map. So far, so good? Okay, this is a relatively popular evolutionary algorithm now for many reasons. What are some of those reasons? What are some of the advantages you can already see about the map elites algorithm compared to some of the other evolutionary algorithms we've seen so far?
You get like a wide variety of gates, and you probably don't get stuck in like local maxima.
Absolutely. Now, whether or not it gets stuck in local optima or not, it's hard to say, but there's definitely a lot of diversity here, which probably helps, right? Remember our metaphor about the fitness landscape getting stuck on Camel's Hump when you actually want to get to Mount Mansfield. You now have a lot of walkers, a lot of hikers that are sitting on a lot, if, or most, of the local optima in this fitness landscape. They're sitting at different places in a lower dimensional space. They don't occupy the original high dimensional fitness landscape. But yeah, we've got a lot of diversity in the population. Okay. All right, so they do all this work beforehand. They run this algorithm for weeks and weeks on a supercomputer. We've got all the time in the world. We haven't sent our physical robot out into the dangerous real world yet. Yeah? Okay, so we've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of controllers, diverse controllers that at least get the simulated robot to do what we want, ready to go. This is the idea behind this algorithm. This is how it's going to deal with speed. When something goes wrong in the real world, the robot needs to be armed with a huge number of diverse and successful controllers ready to go. It's not going to do any evolution once the robot becomes damaged. There just isn't enough time for that. Yeah? Okay, let's try and cross the sim to real gap. Given this cartoon, which controller are you going to run on the physical robot? You can choose any of these 100,000 different controllers. Which one? You're all so scared of the sim to real gap now, you don't want to send any across the gap. Got to send one. Ideas?
You just send a random one?
We could send a random one. Maybe we choose this one, which causes the simulated robot not really to move at all. Let's be a little more ambitious, optimistic. We're not going to send a random one. Send the best one, sure. All right. So we find the most green pixel, which is maybe somewhere out here. Maybe somewhere out here. We're going to send that to reality. Okay. Hold on to that thought for a moment. An additional detail I want to talk about before we go to real. I mentioned that this is a six-dimensional space, and they're showing this cartoon in two-dimensional space, but the authors wanted to show you what the actual behavioral space looks like. So what we're going to see in a moment is a visualization where they're going to take all 6 dimensions and actually pack it into a two-dimensional visualization. Yeah? That visualization actually ended up on the front page of Nature magazine when it was published because it's a pretty picture. Okay, so let's see how they did this. Remember that we have 6 dimensions that correspond to the 6 legs of the quadruped, which is how long the quadruped spends on the ground. Yeah? Imagine we have one controller. We've just run it on the simulated robot, and we want to put it in this 6-dimensional space, but we want to show it. We want to show the behavioral map in 2-dimensional space. Let's look at the amount of time that leg 1 and leg 2 spent on the ground. It's going to be anywhere between 0 and 100% of the time in the simulation. And they're going to discretize it for leg 1 between 0 and 20% of the time, 20 and 40% of the time, 40 and 60% of the time, 60 and 80, 80 and 100% of the time. So they're going to throw away a little bit of the information just for the visualization. They can embed this in 6-dimensional space, no problem, but they want to show it to you in 2D. So there's a cost when we go from high dimensions to low dimensions. This is the cost. We're going to discretize the number and figure out which of these 5 bins the controller belongs to. So far, so good? Okay, they're going to take the amount of time that the second leg spent on the ground, similarly discretize it to, did the second leg spend between 0 and 20% of the time on the ground, 20 and 40, and so on. So they now have 2 coordinates for the first and second leg, which reference one of these 25 big bins. So far, so good? Okay, let's imagine that controller takes us to this middle of these 25 large bins. They're going to do the same thing again. We still have the same controller. We're now going to look at how much time the third and fourth leg spend on the ground, discretize that between 0 and 20, 20, 40, 40 and 60, which will tell us which of these middle-sized bins, which of these 25 middle-sized bins inside this big bin to visit. So far, so good? And you can see what's going to happen next. We're going to go to one of these smaller bins, and then we're going to do the same thing with leg 5 and 6, which is going to tell us which of the 25 pixels inside that smaller bin we should visit, and then we're going to colorize that pixel by the fitness of that controller. So far, so good? Okay. All right. This is what the actual behavioral map looks like. When they evolved using map elites, thousands and thousands of controllers on the simulated robot. They haven't gone to real yet. Yeah? You'll notice there are these patches of red that are spread out. Are they actually spread out? They're spread out in 2D, right? But remember, this is a 2D projection of a 6-dimensional space. In 6-dimensional space, probably, you could do it, probably all of these red pixels are next to one another. They probably form one contiguous red blob in 6-dimensional space. Yeah? Takes a bit to get used to reading and interpreting this this dimensionality reduced behavioral space. Okay, now we're ready to go to real. In this experiment, the investigators are not optimists, but pessimists. They didn't choose randomly. They actually sent one of the worst controllers to reality. It's the worst of the elites. So even though it's a red pixel, it's still probably pretty good because it's the best controller that ever visited that part of behavioral space. Probably causes the robot to crawl a little bit. Yeah? Okay. So they take that and send that to reality. And, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I forgot about this experiment. The colors are reversed. The colors are reversed in this experiment. Red is actually good, and green and blue colors are bad. Yeah? Not a good choice of color scheme, in my personal opinion. We can think of red as hot. That's good. Cool, not so good. Okay. So I'm sorry. They are optimists. They went to the best place in behavioral space. This particular controller causes the simulated robot to move the fastest they've ever seen. Yeah? They send this to reality. Surprise, surprise, that controller does terribly on the physical robot. Yeah? So they were so they took that pixel where that controller is. They don't throw the controller away, but they cool the color of that pixel. They replace the fitness that's stored in that pixel with the fitness on the physical robot. Before, the value that was stored there is the fitness of the simulated robot. They're storing real knowledge now in that single pixel in behavioral space, yeah, which is now green. It causes the physical robot to barely move at all. You'll notice that that green now starts to bleed outward from that pixel and cools pixels nearby. Yeah, we mentioned a few minutes before that this is sort of a continuous space. You can be relatively confident that controllers here that did terribly in reality are also going to do poorly. Similar controllers that cause the robot to move similarly are also going to do poorly in reality. So far, so good? They've incorporated this intuition from the transferability project that we saw last time.
Is that like cooling effect, kind of like a Gaussian?
It is a Gaussian and has to do with the Bayesian aspect of this work. We're not going to talk too much about Bayesian optimization, but yes, they're applying a Gaussian here, which for our purposes basically means that pixels nearby are cooled more, or at least their colors are changed to match more closely the color of the recolorized pixel. And as we move further out, we apply less and less change to the colors of the pixels, or the fitness of the pixels. Yeah? So we started up here with colors representing fitness on the simulated robot. Now, as this experiment has started to run, the colors are now representing different things. In this part of the not the fitness landscape, in this part of the behavioral map, colors are representing reality, or nearby that pixel, things that are close to reality, guesses about what's going to happen in reality. Out here, far from this point, this is still dreamland. The robot has really no idea what's going to happen if any of these are sent to reality. So far, so good? You'll notice that after this first attempt to cross the sim-to-real gap, the algorithm has also changed the colors in the confidence map. Why? And what do the colors represent here now?
Now that we've actually put it into a real life situation, we're pretty confident how it's going to behave because it's no longer simulated.
Absolutely, right? So they've applied a Gaussian here, a Gaussian mask, which has increased the confidence very high at the actual pixel where they sent the controller. We know this is exactly what it causes the real robot to do. And we're somewhat confident about nearby controllers, less confident about controllers further away, and we still have zero confidence about ones that are really far away. Yeah? So far, so good? Okay. Next question. Which one do we send next?
Maybe the next best one based on the updated behavior.
We could send the next best one, which I'm trying to remember now is red, and you can see that's what they actually chose out here. At this point on in the algorithm, they're not choosing which controller to send based just on the color in the behavioral map. They're going to combine the confidence information with the fitness information in the behavioral map to decide which one to send next. How do you think they combine this information? Any ideas or intuitions here?
They kind of I think that they would kind of use the confidence thing as like a weight as far as like how likely or how much precedence they should put on choosing one. Because if one is really, so if it's like gonna do bad and they're confident that's gonna do bad, they're not gonna choose that one.
Exactly. So if they have high confidence that something's going to do poorly, which is the case out here now, that high confidence is going to magnify the chance that they don't send it to reality. Yeah. What's happening in other places in the combined confidence and behavioral map? Imagine we have two controllers in the behavioral map here, like this controller and this controller. Imagine they have equal high fitness. They're both good candidates to send to reality. But imagine that the algorithm is a little bit more confident in one over the other. You would obviously want to send the one that you're slightly more confident will do well in reality to reality. In the cartoon at this point, it's still all uniformly low confidence out here. They're going to do pairwise multiplication. Take all the confidence values and element-wise multiply them with the fitness values, which is going to give you a whole bunch of weighted values in six-dimensional space. Take the highest value of the single controller that results from all of those multiplications. That's the one you send to reality next. Yeah?
When did just get stuck in the loop then? Just testing the same good one that already tested in reality?
Good question, right? Well, let's see what happens. So they're going to they didn't get stuck in a loop at this point because they sent this behavioral space cooled, and confidence space heated up, which sent them to this part of the space. They're going to send this controller to reality now, which also does poorly. So this part of the space gets cooled off in a Gaussian manner, and confidence gets increased in the confidence map in a Gaussian manner in this space, which means this part of the space is definitely not going to be visited the third time. Yeah. Where did they go next? They went here. Oh, you're right. Now they've gone here. So they've gone to this part of the space. This part of the space actually did pretty well. So they don't show it in this picture here. Well, actually, it looks like things got even better here when they went to reality. Confidence was high here, that they're doing pretty well around here. So they might end up staying around here. Good question. It's possible, I guess it's possible that this could still end up being the best multiplication result, and they stay here and keep sending this to reality. Actually, it's a good point. They might have had an additional flag that said don't revisit the same pixel twice. Maybe. Good observation.
Also, this is the final map. I don't know if you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, final map. Right. So we've got some ellipses here. So dot, dot, dot. It's not the third attempt. It's the sixth or seventh. Yep.
So my question was going to be, why didn't they ever explore all that blue space that just like they are low confident about?
Why did they not visit the low confidence space? Because they don't have a lot of time, right? Remember that back in reality, wall clock time is running, yeah? So they're trying to be as optimistic as possible, right? There's no exploration here. There isn't, let's go to a place that I have low confidence about where maybe things will work. This algorithm is pretty conservative. Once it starts to get lucky, once it finds part of the space where behavior is high and confidence is high, it'll tend to hang out there, yeah? There isn't a lot of time for exploration, which is definitely a cost, right? There is a good chance that somewhere else there is an even better solution to the problem, but we're trying to maximize time efficiency here. Other questions? Okay, so let's have a look to what happened to the behavioral map, not in a cartoon, but in reality. This is what the six-dimensional behavioral map looked like before they went to reality and before the physical robot had been damaged, yeah? Physical robot becomes damaged, and now they start transferring controllers from the behavioral map to reality. They started here. This was the first controller sent to reality in the video that we saw a few minutes ago. It's hard to see here in this visualization. I don't know if I can even zoom in and it will help. I don't think it will. Underneath this particular white circle is a cool colored pixel. This did not transfer well to reality, not surprisingly. The algorithm caused them to jump here. This was the second physical attempt, third physical attempt, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh attempt. The seventh attempt they've put in red here because it's sitting in a hot part of behavioral space, and also, although it's not shown in this picture, a hot part of confidence space. Yeah? 7 trials over about 25 seconds. They found, among all the controllers they already had, one that works. Okay. I mentioned one drawback of this algorithm, which is it's somewhat conservative because they're in a hurry here. What's the other drawback of this approach to the sim-to-real gap from other approaches we've seen so far? There's a number of differences between this approach and the other ones. Well, the biggest difference is there's no evolution going on, right? It's all done before deployment, before we go to real. So they can adapt quickly, but there's got to be a cost. What's the cost? Any ideas?
Seems like if you're not actually doing evolution, like you're kind of just randomly generating, or like you're doing some form of like mutation to get the children.
During evolution, yep,
But there's,
beforehand.
like, it feels like there's pretty low confidence that any of the elites are actually elite compared to like something that would actually be evolving it. And I guess you would just have to evolve so many of them to actually have confidence that those are fairly elite solutions.
Exactly. So there's no guarantee that no matter how many of them you actually have, that any of them will provide compensation for whatever injury or whatever's gone wrong with the robot, right? The idea here is to be prepared, come up with as many and as many diverse solutions as possible, so that hopefully they will act as like a minimum spanning set for whatever can possibly happen to the robot in reality. Yeah? Who knows? It depends on the robot, depends where you want to deploy it. Yeah? Okay. Okay, let's look at some actual data now. So they did some experiments with this algorithm. They evolved all these controllers beforehand and then set them aside. This is sort of their portfolio, what they have ready to go. They then performed 6 different experiments, where here's one experiment that I just described to you. They all start from the same point, panel B here. They all start with this initial portfolio, but then they run these 6 different experiments, which alter the behavioral and confidence map as that experiment unfolds. When they start another experiment, they reset the confidence and behavioral map to what it was at the beginning of the experiment. Yeah? Okay, 6 different experiments. Hopefully you can see. In experiment 1, they didn't damage the robot at all. Experiment 2 cut off half of one of the legs. Experiment 3, I guess I should hop out of here so we can see a little better. Experiment 3, they jammed one of the motors. This is a common fault in complex machines. The motor is rotating, you get a bit of grit or sand or a rock in there, and it grinds to a halt, and it's frozen. Any more commands sent to that motor, it won't move. Experiment 4, injure the robot even more, cut off an entire leg. Experiment 5, let's get really sadistic here, remove 2 of the 6 legs. Experiment 6 here, this is the Captain Ahab experiment. Replace the leg with a wooden leg. If we send a robot probe to an outer moon or planet of the solar system, its leg is probably not going to be magically replaced with a wooden block. Why do this? This isn't likely something that's actually going to happen to the robot, but it's meant to be a proxy or a stand-in for something that could happen to the robot, such as?
If the sensor turns off.
Yeah, maybe. If the sensor turns off, this robot, remember, has no touch sensors or proprioceptive sensors or video. All it can, I forgot to mention, the only thing it can sense is how far it moved, right? It's basic. Think of it as a fitness sensor, right? How well or how badly did it do in reality?
There's like a little rubber foot thing that lets it grip the ground.
Sure, a piece could break off. It could step in some mud or regolith or whatever's out there, right? And now suddenly its leg is a little bit heavier than it used to be. Yeah, you're walking around on an alien planet, lots of things that can happen to your feet and legs. This is just meant to approximate a change in mass distribution, but it's still got its 6th leg there. Yeah, they could have probably clamped a lead weight on there as well, would have done the same sort of thing. Yeah, so we're going to look at some data in a moment about how well, it says it here, adaptation time. How much time did it take the robot to adapt to these 6 situations? I think this will work better. Okay. Okay. Let's have a look at, here's experiment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The yellow stars here represent how far the physical robot was moving with these evolved controllers before the injury occurred. You'll notice that in condition 1, the yellow star is high up, because obviously in condition 1 there is no injury. This robot's moving pretty quickly with the evolved controllers. It's moving 0.25 meters per second. It's walking 25 centimeters per second. If we take that best guess and we send it to condition 2, where half the leg is moving, it suddenly stops moving. It moves less than 5 centimeters per second. Yeah? So this is the baseline. This is how the robot is behaving immediately after injury. Not doing very well at all. After 5 or 6 trials on the physical robot, on average, the purple bars are showing how much speed the robot was able to recover by running this algorithm. And a lot of these purple bars are overlapping vertically with this yellow star. Yeah? So you could argue that in condition 2, 3, 4, and 6, the robot has recovered almost as much or maybe even a little bit more speed than it had in the undamaged case. In condition 5, where we really brutalize the robot, doesn't recover. It recovers to some degree, but not back to 100%. Not surprisingly. Yeah? Okay, they did 2 additional experiments, and in the interest of time, they just did C1 and C3. And in this experiment, in experiment 7 and 8 here, everything was exactly the same, but now they generated an alternative descriptor, where the descriptor is the description of behavior. Remember that they created this 6-dimensional behavioral space by kind of somewhat arbitrarily choosing the amount of time the 6 legs spent on the ground as a descriptor of that behavior. We could choose an alternative descriptor, and I'm forgetting what the alternative descriptor was. I think it was closer to the transferability experiment. It was sort of the mean height of the robot during travel, how much it turned, I think, which gives us a different behavioral space with a different dimensionality. If they use 3 behavioral descriptors, then the behavioral space and the confidence space are going to be 3-dimensional. Yeah? They wanted to see whether their nice results here were a result of the way that they described the behavior. Seems, at least for this alternative descriptor, that their algorithm is robust to how you choose to describe the behavior and therefore construct this behavioral space. Question?
Is like the choice of descriptors, is that somewhat analogous to a hyperparameter?
It is absolutely a hyperparameter, right? A hyperparameter, by definition, is some parameter of the algorithm that the human investigator has to decide. It's not the optimizer optimizing that parameter. Yeah? In your code base, all of the synaptic weights, those are known as parameters. They're parameters that are being optimized by your evolutionary algorithm. Hyperparameters, those are the parameters you decide that alter the way your algorithm optimizes the parameters. That's why they're called hyperparameters. Yeah? Population size, how many generations you run your evolutionary algorithm for. In this algorithm, how you describe the behavior, those are all hyperparameters. Okay. They took all of the data from these experiments. And replotted that data, but now they changed the vertical axis to adaptation time in wall clock time. Yeah? So over these 8 different experiments, on average, it took the robot about a minute to recover to this speed. So an average speed of about, whatever that is, 22 centimeters per second. Yeah? If you're a rover and you're sliding down the side of a crater rim, depending on the slope of that rim, of course, 20 seconds, not too bad. Yeah? Maybe you can recover from whatever dangerous situation you're currently in. Yeah? NASA has not seen fit to actually instrument any of their rovers with these recovery mechanisms yet, but maybe in the future. Okay. As I mentioned, they also tried out this algorithm on a completely different robot that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different motors in it. So this is kind of like a snake robot, waving back and forth. And then it's got a 9th motor here that opens and closes the gripper. They looked at 3 different damage scenarios. So in injury condition 1, C1 here, they froze the 4th joint at 45 degrees. In condition 2, this joint suffers a permanent offset. Yeah. So remember, when you create a joint in PyBullet, it can flex inward or extend outward from the default, which is 0. It can happen that in physical motors, the motor gets actually torqued or bent, so that now the default is minus 45, and the arm or the leg or the motor is rotating about minus 45 or plus 20, 23. Another common fault in complex physical machines. They built that in. And in injury condition 3, they were sadistic again and visited 2 different injuries on 2 different motors. And in about 20 seconds time, they were able to recover. This robot was able to recover in about 20 seconds of time the ability to drop balls into the tin. Yeah. Okay, that concludes our discussion of the Map Elites algorithm. It also concludes our discussion of the sim to real gap. Okay, that's the longest lecture subseries in this course. We've covered a lot of ground in the sim to real gap. The sim to real gap, I guarantee you, is not solved yet. Yeah? So if anybody has any interesting ideas, I'm all ears. Any questions about any of that material before we switch gears to the last 15 minutes here? No? Okay. Another big issue in evolutionary robotics, or robotics in general, is scalability, right? So in this class, there are 60 of you writing 60 different fitness functions. And in our exam period, you're going to see 60 different videos of 60 different kinds of evolved robots, which is great. But there's millions, if not billions, of jobs out there that we would like robots to solve. How do we go about creating millions and billions of fitness functions and simulators and robots and run algorithms that are doing sim to real for millions of different kinds of robots? How do we scale up this problem? You can actually see this problem trying to be solved in real time at the moment with ChatGPT. How is OpenAI trying to scale up ChatGPT? How are they trying to make it better? Of course, they're a company, so most of their trade secrets are hidden, but certain aspects of their approach they can't hide by definition. Why?
Well, I was just going to say they're trying to make so it can take in different kinds of media.
That it can take in different kinds of media, right? So obviously they're trying to broaden the diet for ChatGPT. What can it digest? What else? How else are they trying to make ChatGPT smarter?
Learn from you.
Learn from you, right? You, many of you are probably sources of learning for ChatGPT, right? So over the last 15 years or so, it's occurred to AI researchers that no matter how much data you give to a non-embodied machine or an embodied machine like a robot, perverse instantiation is always going to arise. You're going to need lots and lots of people to point and laugh at the perverse instantiation, right? Point out that this was a mistake. You don't necessarily need to say how it was a mistake, just this was a wrong response. And somewhere in the ChatGPT code base, something is being depressed. Probabilities of things are being reduced. Synaptic weights are being reduced for that particular interaction, right? So the problem for ChatGPT and for robotics is how to scale it up. And for the moment, the best candidate for a solution seems to be crowdsourcing. turn over the problem to the general public to allow them to collectively reward and punish the learner. Yeah? So about 10 years ago now, in my lab, we launched this project called Twitch Plays Robotics, which was an attempt to scale up evolutionary robotics by inviting in non-coders, the general public, to help influence the way the robots were evolving through, at that time, a relatively new portal, which was Twitch TV. I assume in 2023, I don't need to explain to anyone what Twitch is. Yeah, we're all good. Okay. All right. So I'm going to walk you through. The Twitch Plays Robotics experiment here. We're going to start We're not going to start with Twitch. We're not going to start with crowds. We're not even going to start with robots. We're going to start with something that hopefully is familiar. Everybody remember the Chinese room problem? Okay, so if we're going to let large numbers of people people who are non-technical, non-coders, to influence to influence robots, they're not going to type fitness functions into Twitch. The only tool we know of that we can use for them to communicate to the robots is natural language. Yeah? This is the one and only lecture in this course where we're going to actually tackle language. Yeah? We saw language way back at the beginning of the course when we talked about the Chinese room problem, right? We have native Mandarin speakers outside the room. They write questions in Mandarin, pass it into the room. The person inside the room does not speak or understand Mandarin. They are just acting as an automaton. They're just an additional mechanism inside the room. They look at what looks to them like a whole bunch of squiggles. They go to this huge lookup table, which you can think of as a neural network if you like, that says in English, which this person does understand, it says, if you see these squiggles, take a fresh sheet of paper and write these other squiggles and pass it back out of the room. If this set of transformations is large enough, you might be able to fool the people outside the room to think that the room or whatever is inside the room understands Mandarin. Yeah? This is exactly what ChatGPT is, right? It doesn't know English. It has just learned how to transform the symbols that make up the English language, or Python for that matter, into other symbols in English or other symbols in Python that humans seem to say is close to the right answer. Yeah? Okay. This approach has been used for a long time. I'm going to skip over this slide. Non-embodied. We're not going to talk about this a little bit. How do humans understand language? There's a huge debate raging on social media at the moment about maybe we're all ChatGPT. Maybe we are all Chinese rooms, and that's all we're doing. We're taking in language, it's being transformed somehow, and we spit out what seem like intelligible responses to our peers. We're no different from ChatGPT. Maybe, maybe not. Let's have a look at the evidence, what we do know about the brain on language. What happens when you put someone in an fMRI machine, a brain scanner, and you talk at them, or you read to them, or they listen to an audiobook? What happens? One thing that happens is the motor strip in the brain lights up. Yeah? If you put on earmuffs or headphones where the strap goes, that's exactly where your motor strip is. If you put someone in a brain scanner and you ask them to open and close their left hand, you will see a particular place on the right-hand side of their motor strip lighting up, and it's drawn sort of here. If you ask them to flex and extend their elbow, which is near left elbow, which is near their left hand, it turns out that a nearby place in their motor strip will also light up. Yeah? Places in the body that are close to one another, hand, wrist, elbow, shoulder, they tend to be co-located or near one another in the motor strip. Yeah? So this is known as the motor homunculus. this little cartoon guy or gal, it actually represents a map. We were just talking about maps. When you move a certain part of your body in a scanner, that part of the motor strip, that part of the motor homunculus lights up. Why are some parts of the motor homunculus bigger than others? What do you think that represents?
There's like more brain real estate dedicated to those parts.
There's more parts of brain real estate dedicated to that. So obviously our tongues are very sensitive. If you're asked to manipulate your tongue while you're sitting in a brain scanner, that part of the motor, a large part of the motor strip will light up. There are particular parts of our anatomy that are missing from this motor homunculus that are not drawn on here because they're absolutely huge compared to other parts of the body. I will leave you to figure out which parts of your anatomy are missing from the motor homunculus. So far, so good? Okay, so back to language. We haven't talked about language yet. This is just putting someone in a scanner and asking them to flex the muscles in that part of the body. That's what you get. It's a fascinating study from a few years back now that's been replicated many times by Pulvermuller and Fadiga here in 2010. They put people in the brain scanner and they did not ask them to move any parts of their body. They read to them, and in the text that they were reading, there were various motoric words. Motoric words are those words that have to do with the motor system, the muscle system, right? So when you hear the word talk, I could ask you to talk, and you would turn on the muscles in your mouth and your throat, and you would start talking. Yeah. Lick is another one. Grasp, pick, walk, and kick. Yeah. You'll notice that obviously lick, pick, and kick sound similar to one another in English. So you might think that if you put someone in a brain scanner and you said these three words to them in sequence, lick, pick, kick, you might think that because they sound similar, they would show up in similar places.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
What happened?
I'm doing my daily paper route, and Dr. Barngard ended up in the paper today. So just thought I'd bring that in. I know you're doing something important right now, but there you are, my friend.
Well, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Danforth, everyone. All right, thank you for that. How was the ride this morning?
So good.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, what does the body have to do with intelligence? Exactly what we're talking about. Okay, back to Pulvermuller and Fadiga. Three similar words. If language is stored in the brain, in the language center of the brain, you would expect three close by parts of the brain to light up. Yeah, seems obvious, right? Thinking about thinking is misleading. Yeah, very different parts of the brain light up. Three very different, physically distant parts of the brain light up when you mention lick, pick, and kick. If you repeat the words talk and lick, which sound very different to one another, they both show up in very similar parts of the brain, the face-related part of the motor homunculus. Yeah? Why do you think that's the case? If you say the words grasp and pick to them, the arm part of the homunculus lights up. If you say the words walk and kick, the leg-related part of the motor homunculus lights up. What's going on?
People kind of like imagining doing those words.
Absolutely. You're living what you hear, yeah? When you're listening to a story, or you're telling yourself a story, or you're reading a story, or you're watching Netflix, you're living what's happening. Or at least your motor strip is living what's happening. Question.
Is that why post-traumatic stress is so intense? Because when you're thrown back, since your brain is basically living whatever it's thinking,
it's a good question. How does this relate to PTSD? I'm not an expert in that area, but given what I know of these studies, I would guess it's related. Yeah. If you are reminding someone who has suffered trauma, you're using words or images that relate to that, you are lighting up their motor strip, And presumably, these are negative physical experiences that they've experienced in the past. Absolutely. That would be my guess. Yeah? Okay. All right. So language, it seems, is rooted in the body in a pretty literal sense. Yeah? So one piece of evidence that suggests a non-embodied system like ChatGPT is at least, ChatGPT seems to do a pretty good job with language. It's not bad. It's hard to argue that it's terrible. It's doing something pretty well. But however ChatGPT is learning about language, it seems like it's learning about it differently from how we learn language. Yeah? Okay. Another line of evidence that suggests there is a very close link between the body and language comes actually from psychology. A very famous psychologist, George Lakoff, wrote several books. One of them, one of my favorite books of all time, it's called Metaphors We Live By. If you're interested in this connection between body and language, I highly recommend Metaphors We Live By. In this book, Lakoff pointed to poetry, language, mathematics, these things that seem very abstract. They seem like things that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for. That part of your brain that lives right above your nose, that's the part for abstraction. It's the part that's furthest from the body. Yeah? Pulvermuller has destroyed, pulverized that myth. Yeah? There is a connection here. Lakoff, a psychologist, didn't point to neuroscience data. He pointed to language itself, and he pointed particularly to metaphors like, for example, don't jump to conclusions. Imagine, think of a friend you have whose native tongue is not English. You're having an argument with them, and you yell at them, don't jump to conclusions, and they've never heard this English metaphor or this English idiom before. Most non-native English speakers, if you ask them, what does this mean? They can actually tell you what this metaphor means. They can guess what don't jump to conclusions means. Some of them can do it because there's a very close metaphor in their mother tongue. Others, for which there is no analog of this metaphor in their mother tongue, still figure it out. Why? How? Seems like a mystery. How do a lot of non-native English speakers know the first time they hear don't jump to conclusions what it means in the context of an argument? Ideas? They understand what jump is. What is jump? We all understand what it is. What is it? Has anyone tried to make a fitness function yet for the jumping robot? Well, what is jumping? What does it actually mean? It seems like a silly question, right? Of course, we all know what jumping is. Do you? What is jumping?
Feels like kind of explosive in a way.
It's explosive. Obviously, jumping is a lot of things. What is the connection between the physical act of jumping and this relatively abstract admonition to not jump to conclusions?
When you jump, you're normally like skipping a section or something. Like, I don't know, like you're just jumping over a step.
Jumping over, right? So this is not jumping on the spot. This is, the long jump, right? There is a patch of ground that you are not in contact with. Whatever the surface of that ground is that you jumped over, you don't feel it. It doesn't mean anything to you. You're bypassing it. Yeah? Okay, here's another one. Don't look back in anger. Another very abstract admonition you can make. There is a motoric word or word phrase hidden in this metaphor, looking back. What's the connection between looking back here and what this metaphor means? This one's a little trickier.
If you're looking back, like literally looking backwards, a lot of times you're looking at something that you previously did.
So human physiology, most of our sense organs are forward-facing because we used to be apex predators, arguably still are, which means when we're traveling, most of our attention is in front of us, usually on prey or a mate. So most of what is in front of us is in our future. And as we turn and look back, we are observing things that are in our past. We're out of time. When we start next time, we're going to play the embodied metaphor game. There are hundreds of embodied metaphors in English and all languages. Think of some and bring them to class on Thursday. See you then. Thank you.